So my talk yesterday was fairly philosophical and methodological. This is a much more personal talk, but hopefully it will also be helpful to folks in thinking about what the future of your career in testing might look like, and some of the things you can think about. Yesterday's talk was also a lot more polished than this one is probably going to be. It's a talk I've given a number of times to a number of different audiences, and I've worked on it a lot for a long time. This talk I was still figuring out what I wanted to say about 20 minutes ago. And to be honest, it's also about a topic that I'm still very much in the process of figuring out, so it's somewhat raw. I gave a talk about autism at Agile DevOps Days London a couple of months ago, and I was horribly nervous. And I'm not that much less nervous today, so no promises as to how it will go. We'll just see what happens. So for the majority of my life, I always felt like something was slightly off, like I was kind of walking through mud. I had a really hard time translating ideas into action. As a result, I was labeled an underachiever and a quitter. And I had a lifelong struggle trying to be the person I thought I was supposed to be, or even the person that I thought I wanted to be. And at some point I started to wonder if I might be on the autism spectrum. But I wanted to be really careful because it's become almost cool these days to label yourself autistic. Jerry Seinfeld decides that he doesn't really like hanging out with people that much, so he must be autistic. Gary Newman, who's one of my favorite musicians ever, took an online test and diagnosed himself with Asperger's syndrome. And I was very lucky. I had access to someone who was very skilled and experienced at working with people on the spectrum, and we worked together over a period of a number of months of really digging into my experience and my life and why I thought the way I did and why I did things the way I did. And at some point we came to the conclusion that I was, in fact, a person with autism. And that started a whole process of re-understanding my entire life, of going back to when I was 5 and when I was 10 and when I was 15 and going, oh, that's why I did that this way, or why I didn't do that this way. And it also triggered a certain process of sort of self-forgiveness. We live in this age where we're obsessed with people doing amazing, big, great things. Unicorn companies and 10Xers and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I had to learn was that living a simple, independent, decent, ordinary life is actually a really big accomplishment and something that's worth taking a certain amount of pride in. And the other thing that happened was I started looking around myself at the world in a different way. And in particular, I began to notice companies that were talking about employing autistic people. And this was something that made me really happy because there was discussion about what autistic people had to offer and the strengths that we have. One of the problems with autism is it's labeled a disability, and it's always cast in terms of what we lack, what we're missing, what we can't do. You know, we can't empathize, even though that's not true. We can't make eye contact. We can't understand social cues. We're missing some kind of protein in our genetic structure. We didn't get enough oxygen when we were being born, whatever the case may be. And so it was really nice to see companies like SAP and Microsoft and others like that start to say, well, actually these folks have some skills that can help us make our companies better, and we want to hire them because of that. And in particular, one of the things I saw was a number of companies starting up around employing autistic people as testers. But unfortunately, that actually worries me a little bit, based on my background working with things like DevOps and continuous delivery. Because the story around autism and testing is generally that we are really good at repetitive tasks that require intense concentration and attention to detail. Now, first of all, I have to find that a little bit amusing because I'm the last person on the planet you would want to give one of those tasks. A few years ago, my mom was cleaning out my parents' house, and she sent me all of my old report cards. I got this big fat envelope of every single class I ever took from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. And I sat down and I started reading it one day, and it was embarrassing. Because class after class, year after year, it said the same thing. Understands concepts quickly, makes careless mistakes, needs to pay more attention to details. Makes careless mistakes, needs to pay more attention to details. So if you were hiring for a company of autistic people doing repetitive tasks requiring concentration and attention to detail, you wouldn't want to hire me. But more importantly, I worry that we are training people and building companies around an activity that may be being automated out of existence. And when you look at things like DevOps and continuous delivery, you can't do manual regression testing when you're deploying 10 times a day. But in my experience, you actually can't even do it when you're deploying twice a month. One of the anti-patterns that I see in a lot of Agile organizations is you have testers doing manual testing first and then trying to catch up and build automated tests. And what happens is they fall farther and farther behind. And they become a drag on the organization, and quality goes down over time instead of going up over time. The other challenge is one of the things that DevOps talks about is this idea of testing in production. And one thing I need to clarify on behalf of the whole DevOps community is that test in production doesn't mean that you don't test before production. It just means you don't stop then. And really what's happening is that the boundary between monitoring and testing is getting blurred. And we're focusing now not just on, well, do we have enough disk space and is there enough network bandwidth, but how is the application actually behaving in production? You can't have somebody manually poking at your applications in production every 5 minutes or even every hour. But even before you get to DevOps, when you think about Agile, one of the lessons of Lean is that silos create waste and delay. When you have handoffs, when you have queues, what happens is that when you look at how long it takes you to actually do something, a lot of that time is spent waiting and moving things around. So there's a challenge if we think about things in terms of, well, we have this special class of people with special kinds of skills, and they're sitting over here in the corner doing this testing that's separate and different from the rest of the organization. The other thing that happens is that silos actually degrade quality. Partly because you have translation errors, you have requirements, and then you have a design, and then you have your tests, and things get lost in translation. But it's also partly an issue of accountability. That, why is it that developers are not accountable for quality? It's QA that's accountable for quality. I remember almost 30 years ago now working at Apple in the late 1980s. Actually, that was more than 30 years ago. Whoops. Anyway, there was this big giant software quality organization that reported to a completely separate VP from development. And quality wasn't that great. And at some point, they dissolved the entire department. And they took the testers and just mixed them into the development teams. And what happened was quality skyrocketed overnight. So where does that leave us? Whether we're talking about autistic people looking for employment or we're just talking about testers in general, are we living in a career, are we training people for a career that isn't going to exist in 5 years? What do we do? Where do we go from here? And what I want to talk about is the possibility that if we think a little bigger about what autistic people are actually good at, that might help us think about the future of testing. And one thing I want to make really clear is I don't mean to imply that in order to be a good tester you have to have autism. I just think that it's a potentially useful lens to think about what is it that we're trying to do altogether. And before I go any further, I want to say also that This whole idea that autistic people are good at repetitive tasks, blah, 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 is a generalization. And I'm now going to turn around and make some generalizations of my own. But they are generalizations, and we have to be careful. The thing about autism, it is a cluster of characteristics, and no two people have exactly the same combinations of those, which is why you may have heard the phrase that if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So you need to take what I'm saying today with some numbers of grains of salt. But nonetheless, let's plow on. And I want to start by telling a story about a very wonderful film that I saw called Autism in Love. It is a sometimes heartbreaking and sometimes heartwarming story about people on the spectrum trying to navigate romantic situations. And one of the heartwarming stories is about this particular couple. They'd been dating for some time. They were trying to figure out where they were in their relationship and whether they wanted the same things and were they at the same place, and they weren't. And the reason they knew they weren't was they did a really amazing thing. They talked about it. Somewhat awkwardly, but very, very honestly and straightforwardly, they kind of laid it out for each other of, this is what I want, and this is what you want, and we don't want the same thing, and what are we going to do? And then they did the next amazing thing, which is instead of freaking out and running away, they worked with it. And you see them working through their relationship until over the course of a few months, they get to the point where they are in the same place and they do want the same thing. And eventually one day he takes her to the park and he lays out the blanket, he gets down on his knee, he takes out the ring, he asks her to marry him, she says yes. If you watch it and you don't cry, you're not human. But the point of the story is that they were able to give each other really straightforward feedback about where they were and the problems or the challenges, the gaps with where they were. Last night I talked about feedback as being information about the gap between actual and expected. And if we don't have accurate feedback, we can't do anything. If you look at this whole information age that we live in, and computers and the internet and so on and so forth, none of it would exist without Shannon's information theory, which was developed in the 1940s. But Shannon developed this to solve a very specific problem at the time. They were just figuring out this idea of feedback-based systems. There was no such thing as binary. There was no such thing as digital. There was no such thing as a computer. It was all about transmitting feedback over continuously changing electrical signals, which could get corrupted. And so Shannon's theory was all about how do you guarantee or ensure that you can transmit accurate information when your signal might get corrupted. And that's really the beginning of the computer age. So what these people were able to do was give each other accurate information and then work with it. And so much for the clicker. The other thing that people on the spectrum tend to be good at is seeing patterns. And because we can see patterns, we can see holes in the patterns. My entire career is built on not getting brought in by companies that say, well, we want to roll out Agile across 1,000 engineers. Please teach us how to do Agile. I get brought in when they've rolled it out and it's not working the way they wanted it to. And they say, well, we're doing Agile and it's not working. Help us fix it. What is it that we're missing? What are the pieces that aren't coming together? My wife is a graphic designer and she likes to have me critique her designs. And to be perfectly honest, it took me a long time to learn how to give her critique in a kind and absorbable fashion. But she stuck with it because I was good at looking at designs and seeing the places where they just didn't quite come together. And the other thing about folks on the spectrum is that we tend to deal with a lot of anxiety. So if, for example, you're on vacation and you're at the beach and it's sunny out, and your phone is turned off, your anxiety level is probably somewhere around 0, where ours is more like 3 or 4. And one of the reasons for that is that we're really good, and we're sort of cursed with being good at thinking about what might go wrong. You know, this is, I think, probably my 7th trip to Berlin in the last 2 years. I love coming here. I've got it all figured out. I've flown through Schiphol I don't know how many times. Nothing ever goes wrong. I always make my flight. It's all sorted out. And yet every single time I still fret about, well, what happens if the passport lanes are congested? And what happens if this, that, and the other thing? So we're really good about wondering about potential problems. So we're good at feedback. We're good at seeing patterns and problems with patterns. We're good at thinking about what might go wrong. How is that valuable? Well, as I said last night, Agile and DevOps and design thinking and lean startup and all of those things all run on feedback. They're not about going fast. They're not about how many times you can deploy to production. They're about how quickly you can get feedback. You can get information about that gap between actual and existing back from production. So you need feedback, you need full feedback, you need accurate feedback. The second thing is that we live in a world of service, and service is about systems, and systems that emerge as patterns. You know, flying isn't just about, and perhaps isn't even mostly about, sitting in your seat on the plane. It's about getting a comfortable seat, being able to buy a ticket on the website. It's about getting to the airport. It's about having a good meal. It's about arriving on time. And one of the things that people tend to forget, it's about getting help with problems, that figuring out how to find your luggage and getting help finding your luggage when it gets lost is part of the actual service. And so you need the ability to think in terms of patterns and systems in order to build good services. And finally, when these services become complex, when they become intertwined with each other, and the interactions become very rich, what happens is that failure starts to bubble in the system and become inevitable. When you look at the work of the industrial safety folks, they talk about how complex systems are always running in a degraded mode. And so thinking about what might go wrong is actually part of thinking about making things right. So we still haven't fully answered the question of why do we need testers to have these skills? Don't we want everyone doing it? Don't we want to bake quality in? Don't silos cause a problem? What is the real value that we bring with these particular skills? And the answer is that we have to be really careful about cognitive bias. No matter how user-centered you are or empathetic you are or how much user testing you do, it's still instinctive for us to be attached to the things that we make. As a designer, we want to think that our designs are good. As a developer, we want to think that our code is good. And testers are the only ones who truly have allegiance to the users. And that may seem kind of glib, but let's look at an example that will show us why that's true. So in the United States, we went through this whole thing called the Affordable Care Act, which the Republicans nicknamed Obamacare, which was about reforming health insurance. And one of the ideas was that any person could log onto a website and buy health insurance through something called healthcare.gov. And when healthcare.gov first went live, and everyone tried to buy health insurance on October 1st, it melted to the ground. It was a complete unusable disaster. And there were a lot of reasons for it. One of the reasons was that the Democrats intentionally took the development project and broke it into lots of little pieces and spread them across a lot of different departments so it would be harder for the Republicans to kill the budgets. So they intentionally fragmented the work. But what happened? What was the first thing that people said when it melted to the ground? It wasn't tested properly. So when users are unhappy, testers are the first ones to get blamed, which when you think about it is really dumb. right? The testers didn't write the bad code. They didn't come up with the bad designs, but we're the ones who get blamed anyway, and so we're the ones who are really focused on whether users are happy or not. And if we want to think about quality from a truly user-centered perspective in the context of service, we have to think about it across 4 dimensions, and we have to bring all of those dimensions together. The first is outcomes. Users don't actually care about the thing that you built, regardless of how wonderful it is. What they care about is whether they can accomplish something with the help of that thing that you built. You know, I don't want to buy a plane ticket because I want to buy a plane ticket. I want to buy a plane ticket because I want to get to Berlin so I can speak at a conference. There was a wonderful presentation I saw from a designer from Airbnb a few years ago, and she said that when they were designing version 2 of their platform, they had this epiphany when they realized that the product was the trip. Right? The reason that I have an Airbnb here in Potsdam is to help me have a successful trip. And they needed to design from that perspective, from the perspective of the outside, of what the user cared about, which wasn't actually their product. The second is that the way that users achieve those outcomes is by interacting with your service through journeys. So, you know, with the example of the airline, there's a whole process that starts with the website, and then it goes through the taxi cab, and then it goes through security, and then it goes through finding something to eat, finally getting on the plane, getting a decent meal, going through customs, so on and so forth. And all of those pieces have to come together. I don't judge my experience of flying by whether my seat was comfortable. I judge it by that along with a whole bunch of other things put together. Third, none of it does any good if the website is down when I need to use it, or if it's slow, or if you've lost my data or let it get stolen, or if I can't get help when I need it, if I call you on the phone and what I hear is the next agent will be available in an hour and a half. And finally, users expect us to be continually improving the quality and the features of our service, and they expect us to do that in a coherent way so we can absorb it. One of the things that we've seen happening just in the last couple of years is companies starting to stage releases where they actually tell their users, we're working on a new version, and instead of just throwing this completely new user interface at them, that process of delivering change is itself something that gets designed. And that takes us to a really interesting place. And a really interesting idea, something I just want to throw out there that I kind of like to play with, which is the idea that if delivering change is actually part of the service, that means that design and development are part of operations. They're part of running the business. We can't think of them separately anymore as this thing that happens off on the side. No, design and dev and agile and test automation and all of this stuff is part of the daily operations of your business. So the point of all of this is that quality of service crosses all of those 4 dimensions of outcomes, journeys, access, and continuity. And you have to, however you are ensuring quality, you have to think about all of it. And testers are really the only ones who think about all of it. You know, even when you look at things like service design, which is supposed to address the entire journey, it tends to focus on the customer experience more than how that experience is actually delivered. Designers don't typically think about security. They don't typically think about designing what happens when there's a security breach. In the United States, one of the major credit reporting agencies had a breach and 140 million people had their data compromised. And the process of dealing with that breach after the fact was a complete nightmare. And the brand reputation of that company plummeted as much because of what happened after the breach as because of the breach itself. And so nobody was thinking about that. But from the perspective of quality and testing, from the perspective of feedback between the gap between actual and expected, of seeing patterns, of thinking about what might go wrong, those are the kinds of things that somebody needs to think about. And I think what I'm proposing here is we might be folks who have the skills and are positioned in a place to think about that. And none of that has anything to do with automation, and none of that goes away regardless of how much automation you do. So in closing, I want to give a little example of a place where QA, in my mind, didn't happen. And it involved something that wasn't a feature, it wasn't developed, but it was really important. So a couple of years ago, Spotify released a new privacy policy, and it was very poorly worded. And it sounded like what they were saying was, we own all your data and we can do anything we want with it. We can give it to our friends, we can give it to the NSA, we can post it on the internet, we can sell it to Amazon. We own you. And people freaked out. So here's a tweet that got 1,300 retweets, so it probably got seen by some hundreds of thousands of people. Spotify confirmed evil. And Spotify, they issued a press release and they wrote a blog post and they said, we're really, really sorry. That's not what we meant. We never meant to tell you we own your data. We actually meant to craft a really skillful privacy policy. We didn't word it very well and we're sorry. And there was a lot of, apparently temporary, but still a lot of damage done to their brand. And so my question of this is, who tested that? I think the answer is nobody tested it. You see this way too often with marketing and customer support and things that aren't ostensibly part of development, which is nobody's testing it, and it has as much impact on the experience and on the relationship between the company and the customer. And this isn't the kind of thing that's going to go away with automation, and it is the kind of thing that requires the ability to think about systems as a whole and to think about what could go wrong with those systems. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your coming and listening. Thanks.